Hi, everybody. Welcome again to the Stratosphere Lounge. I'm your host, Bill Whittle, trying to figure it all out here in the heat of the moment. We keep talking about making a move, and I see here on the backstage page for Ustream, I see the free plan you were using will be discontinued soon. Upgrade to a pro plan to keep broadcasting with advanced features. Well, I'd be happy to pay for a service. I've always felt that I'd be happy to pay for this. But what I'm not really ready to do is to commit to a per user view thing because I might become suddenly popular or something like that. What the hell do I do then? My God, this thing is a mess. Yeah, it looks like the ad block isn't working either. Anyway, I got the comments there. I've got. It just gets worse. It just gets worse and worse every single time. And I've got the screen there, and I know I'm recording on my QuickTime, so yeah, YouTube streams something or other. Yeah. Dave Wellman says Pro. I can't possibly use Pro. Disqualified from Pro. If it was Pro, I wouldn't be here. Anyway, hope everybody's doing well. It looks like we finally got everything's kind of sorted out. I think at last, more or less. So, yeah, we may actually get to some questions today, I think. What I thought that would be, huh? Just got so carried away with the Star Wars thing last week that I just started, and good rants are hard to come by. So let's see here. We'll go to the Facebook page. Not much to report really this week. Busier than hell. I know it maybe seems hard to believe, but the volume of work that I have to do is just on getting both of these things up and running is just spectacular, enormous. And I'm also setting up a 501c3. So that'll be good news. And once that gets a little further along, I'll be happy to talk about that too. So, man, everything today, as usual. So I think we ought to just jump into the questions since we missed questions last week. I think it seems like the least I could do. So let's just go ahead and do that. Find it. Yeah, I hope everybody's doing well out there. Facebook. They just every day just change and change and change. So let's see. Okay. I think we're good to go now. So somewhere in here, I'm trying to do all three. I need a producer or take it more seriously, one or the other. I'd probably producer be easier, I guess. I did not commemorate the day. I'll get to all of that. I'm here on the question page, and off we go. It looks like Steve Darrow is number 1 and number 2, and make sure those things are in the right order. Yeah, they seem to be. Okay, so here we go. Questions only today, and we're on our way. Steve Darrow says, over a year ago, we discussed how to best introduce a newbie to your work. You seemingly out of nowhere came up with the idea of a Best of Bill section on BillWhittle.com. What happened to that? What happened to that is I am an amazing source of new ideas and probably the worst person in the world to run them to completion. However, there are some exceptions to that particular case. By the way, this was the question I was hoping you'd answer in TSL 185 because you were talking about some of your videos, but I like the fanfare for my question. Perhaps you should do that every time. Steve Darrow. The BillWhittle.com is long overdue for not just a facelift, but a face transplant, I think. All of this stuff is expensive and time consuming. And we're basically just kind of idling over here, to be honest with you. The YouTube suppression and the Facebook suppression has been very effective. I hate to say it, but it's true. They really, really are squeezing us, and it's not only affecting our membership in terms of the number of people we can reach, it's not only affecting our metrics for those few people that support us, in a bigger way. And finally, it's bad for morale. I don't need to know. I mean, I don't know what to do about that. But whatever it is something we're just going to have to weather. And which brings me back again to this endless debt of gratitude I have for our regular members who put up with all kinds of nonsense for me and just basically keep us going here. Yeah, somebody said I might have had the ranking wrong. No, this is most relevant, new, all comments. Is that rank the comments? No, it doesn't. I'm not messing with it. It used to make sense. You could used to be that you could rank your questions on Facebook by number of upvotes, but they've just changed everything. So I'm just going to go with what we got. So the answer to your question there, Steve, is that we will be there and get that up as soon as we do the facelift on the webpage, which is long overdue, and I think will be a big improvement. Let's go on to number 2. Hey, look, it's Steve Darrow, who says, the left doesn't seem to understand the difference between physical capital, which is wealth, and human capital, which is a person's skills and talents that are valued in the market. Our philosophy seeks to build valuable human capital in the largest swath of the population possible. The progressive philosophy is fixated on spreading the physical capital as evenly as possible from each according to his ability. Are the progressives willfully ignorant of the distinction between these two types of capital? Well, they certainly understand what human capital is on some level, Steve, because all of their income comes from other people's hard work. So that's a start. You're asking a rational question of an irrational philosophy. You're asking people to see the value in a system whose value is so self-evident, and they're not interested in human capital. They're interested not in capital either in the way we understand. What they're interested in is money. They're interested in other people's money. They do not have the effort. They're either the willpower or the brains, or mostly they're just not so much stupid as just lazy. And as we mentioned a couple times before, the kind of the or liberal, like the original liberal, uber liberal idea as a college professor, because college professor is very, very convinced he's just the smartest guy in the world, when in point of fact he's probably not in the top 10%, but he's probably 11 or 12. But he's upset about the fact that other people have more money than he does, and so people like that, and people all the way down the social strata, including all the way up the social strata, I might point out, but for different reasons, people feel like this is, these attacks on, I don't even like the word capitalism. If the word was invented by Karl Marx, and I believe it was, I don't want anything to do with it. Capitalism is certainly what we call our system, and I'm not attacking capitalism. I'm attacking the word, especially today. When that word was founded, when Marx was writing what he was writing, we were going through a tremendous trauma, as we are right now. We were going from an agricultural age to an industrial age. Now we're going from an industrial age to an information age. And so Marx basically was writing about a time where there was a tremendous amount of social upheaval and a tremendous amount of injustice, really. And so he used a bunch of terms that just don't have any meaning really anymore. And the reason I'm getting into this argument is because if you call this free market economy of ours capitalism, it's designed to give people the sense that you can't play unless you have capital. In other words, the word itself is designed to exclude most everybody. And when you really get down to thinking of capitalism, you think of Mr. Moneybags, whatever his name is, from Monopoly, right? Big big fat guy with a vest and a huge stomach and a top hat holding 2 bags with dollar signs on him, right? That's what capitalism is. I have the capital I need to play the game. And when you think about the time that Marx was writing, you realize that, if you wanted to get started there, you wanted to start a factory that required actual capital. There were cases of people like Carnegie and many others working themselves out of complete poverty to becoming enormous capitalists. But the term is, as Eric says, it's meaningless. It has no meaning. You don't need capital in order to be a player in this capitalist free market system of ours. You need a little bit of money, but we're not even talking about financial strategies. For example, you can be part of a free market economy and create an enormous amount of wealth for everybody without investing a dime, and I ought to know, because I ought to know. You can create enormous amounts of productive labor and ideas and so on without having a big sack of money. So I don't really like the term that much, again, because it's kind of got this built-in prejudice against it. But basically, what you're saying is true. They don't. I think probably the best way to put this, Steve, is that the left assumes that we don't see any value in people. That's the assumption. That's what they used to sell the envy and the hatred to the class divisions. And I don't see that class divisions exist in this country. I'm not so naive to say that there are not people of different economic levels, needless to say. There are richer people and poor people. We say middle class, upper class, lower class, or whatever you want to call it. But they're not classes in the way that the term was understood, again, when Marx was writing. In those days, in the 1800s, if you were a member of the nobility or the upper class in Britain, it was pretty near the divine right of kings, right? The king could do anything, essentially. They had Parliament enforcing him. At that time, I'm reading an awful lot about Oliver Cromwell lately. But my point is, if you were in England in 1824 and you were waiting for something, and the Duke or the Earl came by and wanted to get in front of you in line, well, he's going to, by God, get in front of you in line, and you should know your place. Same was true in Russia and all of these societies. The idea that there is a class of people who are the nobility, and there's another class that is the gentry and the yeomanry or the peasants all the way down the line. These were immovable, fixed positions. You were pretty much born into them, and they were almost impossible to break out of. There are a few stories from those times when you would find people who worked their way from working class into middle class. Many did. All of them did, essentially, for all intents and purposes, by what we call poverty today. But many people worked themselves from being working people up to being gentlemen, and in some cases, upper class nobility. And the existing nobles had nothing but contempt for these people. He's not a real proper. He's not a proper baron. He's a merchant. He's a trader. He's a guy who got his title through money and all the rest of it. So you had these aristocrats who didn't like the idea of money. Why do you need money if you're an aristocrat? You just order people around. You have political power over people. Your holdings, your vast estates generate revenue, and you have peasants living there, and they generate some revenue, but you don't pay for anything in the sense where you have to reach into your pocket. And one of the things that's most shocking to me about these end-stage nobles in the last days of real aristocracies was just how unbelievably consistently cheap they were. Dishonestly cheap, fraudulently cheap. It seems to be a running thread that these people with these vast amounts of money and these vast estates, would go to a tailor, let's say, and they'd order a new suit, and the tailor would basically spend every dime he's got in order to produce something spectacular for his lordship at an agreed upon price. His lordship gets the thing, the guy submits the bill, and then his lordship basically dicks this guy around for a year, 2 years, 7 years, 10 years, maybe never pays them at all. And just this is utter contempt for the idea that, oh yes, well I owe them and I owe this and I owe that. Oh, it's just too bad. Just beastly commoners and they're in savage demand to be repaid the money that I stole from them. So much of the terminology that we're using these days, or that the left is using these days, is not only 200 years old. It probably never really made a whole lot of sense in the first place. But that's why the words are there. And that's why controlling the language is the same thing as controlling the culture. And why we already lose a significant part of the battle before the battle even begins, just by agreeing to fight it on their battlefield of choice using their words. Capitalist, there's just scores of them. Socialism is kind of a nice word. Everybody likes to be social. Social would be social. Yeah, why not? They don't call it communalism. They don't call it regimentationism. They just socialism. So, in any event, the direct answer to your question is they don't think that we see people as valuable. Their entire philosophy is convincing working people that the people they work for are bloodless, inhuman monsters who do nothing but suck all of the work and life out of them. They just do nothing but leech out of them. Because this is the final thing here, and this is the main thing. In order to gin up this kind of envy and hatred, in order to gin up enough support for such a dreadful system, you have to do two things. You have to convince people that the rich people didn't earn the money they've got. And then secondly, and more importantly, you have to convince them that the reason they're rich is because they took money not just from people, but they took money from you. In other words, that guy's rich off of your back. You see this a lot of times with unions. People say, "Oh, he built this company." Well, it's true that you and the founder of the company built it together. You were compensated for that, and this wouldn't be here without him. It'd be here without you. It wouldn't be here without him. There'd be no Apple computer without Steve Jobs. There would be an Apple computer without the thousands of people who work in the Apple store. Those people are interchangeable, and they are working at a job that pays a certain rate, and that's it. And if you want to make more money, you can either become more scarce and rarer, have more skills that are in higher demand, or you can ditch the security of a regular job and join the exciting world of entrepreneurism, which I can tell you from experience is it's work, and it's and people who run a business know. When I say it's stressful, it's the kind of stress I not only willingly take on, but I enjoy. But it is stressful. You have to worry about making payroll in a way that when you're an employee, you generally don't have to worry about that. We just got finished with a 3-year audit, which took enormous amounts of time and significant amount of money to basically go through the last 3 years of every single check that we ever wrote and every single transaction we ever made, and convinced the IRS that the deductions we claim were legitimate. And after a 3-year audit, they disallowed something like $1,000 over 3 years, which is a very good outcome for me, but it is an outcome that took full time. One of the reasons you see Bill leaving here, he's on vacation now, thank God, but one of the reasons you see Bill leaving here at 7 o'clock at night is because he has to go over every single document, every single transaction, everything we ever wrote, ever, and put them in order. And we went in there and we showed him we were telling the truth. And the outcome was good, but it was time consuming and energy consuming, and and expensive. So there you go. These are things that people who work at Apple, the Apple Store, don't have to worry about. And I know because I was an employee for almost all of my life. What is it? IAOIS AWAC. It's got to be an acronym for something. But in any event, how's that 40-hour work week going? Yeah, that great line is so true about entrepreneurs. They're people who can't bear to work a 40-hour week, so they end up working an 80-hour week. Yeah, absolutely right. Okay, so moving on here. Merlin Wendelboe, the man with the coolest name on the internet, who's also a fine fellow, has this to say. Oh, he much more votes than the other ones. Like I said, I can't link these. You'd think they'd list them in order, but I can't do it. Anyway, here we go. Merlin's question is, in the recent religious rights case, I heard the baker lost at every court until his overwhelming win at SCOTUS. It was overwhelming, 7-2 in the Supreme Court, which implies that every lower court got it wrong. Is there no punitive action that can be applied to those lower courts and judges? I don't know if we want to be in the business of punishing people for bad decisions, especially judges. I know that so much of what they do is tainted by their ideology. They'd say the same thing about us. So I don't think that that there's really any reason to go after the judges for this, or people of the lower courts. I do think that the two men involved with this were fairly loathsome people. The two men that brought this case all the way to the Supreme Court. And I say loathsome because there's just something very, something very insecure and petty about it. So let me talk about the cake issue. For those of you who may have been visiting other planets during the last several years, I think it was back in 2014, a gay couple went into a very small local bakery and asked for a wedding cake, which he was ready to provide. And when they asked him to decorate the cake personally, he refused on the grounds that homosexuality was against his religious beliefs. So instead of going someplace else, these two men decided to take this guy to court, and they basically ruined him. He damn near went out of business. They took the case all the way up to the Supreme Court. The man's life was just harassed, and I know what that's like to some fraction. I mean, just a shadow of what they've been through. I know what that's like, just a shadow of it. And made his life a living hell because he refused to artistically decorate a cake made for a gay wedding. That was the ruling, was that it was the Supreme Court ruled that by making him do artistic work, they were violating his First Amendment rights. But I think that's a ridiculous part. I think the ruling was a correct outcome, but the whole thing doesn't make any sense. And then you hear people getting into exculpatory things like, well, he also didn't make cakes for divorced couples. People sometimes have divorce parties. He wouldn't do that. That was against his religion. Wouldn't make Halloween cakes because he thinks Halloween is a little bit satanic, and that's his right. And he didn't, the Great Pumpkin didn't sue him in lower courts and take him all the way up to the Supreme Court either. Now, as I mentioned in the episode of Right Angle that we just did about this, I'm a purist in this regard, and I don't have the insecurity or just the plain meanness that these two people had. So I'll just say what I've said before on Right Angle and many times in the past. In the public sphere, it must be 100% colorblind and that every single American have access to public facilities regardless of their race, creed, sexual orientation, all the rest of it. I believe that 100%. I believe that there's no right to exclude people from any public event based on anything on who they are. Only can exclude them on the basis of something they've done which would make them a criminal. I believe this wholeheartedly. But the flip side of this is I am not a purist, I'm just consistent. I think that a person who owns a business should be able to do whatever they damn well want with that business. We're very used to seeing signs that say we reserve the right to refuse service to anyone. That's the essence of private property as far as I'm concerned. So would they have a right to exclude him? Just say, nope, sorry, I don't serve gay people? I think he does have that right as the owner of a private business. I think he has the right to say, I don't serve black people. I think he has the right to say, I don't serve conservatives. And he has the right to say, I don't serve conservative named Bill Whittle. I don't serve these people. I'm not going to sue this guy over this. It's his business. For God's sakes, the private business of Facebook, as I mentioned earlier, and Google, YouTube, is discriminating against me and half of the country on a daily basis. And they're costing us our livelihoods as well. Those two men going to another baker didn't cost the gay men their livelihood. It nearly cost the baker his livelihood. And the discrimination against conservatives is costing a lot of us our livelihood. But that's my feeling on the thing. And I don't think anybody has a right to tell you what to do with your private business. If somebody wants to run a restaurant that only caters to Thai people, what am I going to do? Am I going to go there and am I going to argue with the guy? Oh, this isn't fair. This hurts my feelings. No, I'm going to go someplace where they don't exclusively cater to Thai people. I think a person has a right to do that. Now, you can say that's reprehensible. Fine. Okay. So it's reprehensible, according to you. And you don't get to tell this guy what he does on his own private property. If you don't like it, you can go to another restaurant, which is why the public sector is an exception. You don't get to go to another government. And if we did, this would sure be a much better world. So I think that needless to say, he had the right to refuse them. And for those people who get completely lathered up about this, oh, this is just, this is all people are human beings. Listen, if you're saying that this man is required to serve everybody equally, then what you're saying is that a little old man and a little old lady, little old Jewish couple who have a bakery and tattoos on the inside of their forearm, and a group of American Nazis come in and they say, we want a big swastika cake and we want little kind of like icing barbed wire around the outside. And if a couple who'd survived the Holocaust and lost virtually all of their relatives and family had their lives destroyed by these Nazis, according to this theory, they'd have to bake the guy the cake. Otherwise, they're bigots and they're prejudiced. And this is when you realize that this is not about what they say it's about. It's not about equal service to everybody. If I were to make that argument with somebody like Seth MacFarlane, for example, who's saying this is just a step away from telling black people will not be served here, you then say, okay, so that means Holocaust survivors have to make a cake for Nazis, right? And that's when you realize this is not about what they say it's about. It's not about serving everybody regardless of their beliefs. It's about what political beliefs are acceptable and which ones are not, according to them. Now, I don't have any sympathy for Nazis. I think Nazis are loathsome and disgusting. If Nazis came into a business I owned, I would invite them out. And same goes for the Klan, and same goes for a bunch of other radical, hateful people. I reserve the right to refuse service to anyone, and anybody who comes in here wearing a white hood or an armband is not welcome here. And we can agree with this on the left. But what they can't agree on is not serving people who have they are convinced that they know what's right and what's wrong, and everything that's right must be allowed, must be enforced, and everything that's wrong must be banned and prohibited. And they have no doubt that they're completely right about all this stuff. And they're right in some cases. They're right about Nazis. They're not right in many other cases. They're not that smart. They're really not very smart. And they're not very nice either. As I said, if it had been me, it might have pissed me. Look, I'm so used to dealing with this kind of prejudice, I mean, it's just everywhere out here. And I'm just used to it. It doesn't mean I like it, but I come down to, again, if this person is if somebody runs a bar and all they do is trash Donald Trump, let's say, from the bar, I don't think that gives me the right to sue the bartender and tell him that he must make this place a safe space for me to sit down and have a beer and watch a football game. I think my choice is to go to another bar. Not so hard, really. And needless to say, the number, at least one case where they asked this exact same question of a Muslim baker, and he said, "No way, I'm going to do it." Nobody raised a peep about that, because being Muslim is a protected class in America, and being Christian's not only not protected, it's open season on Christians. They're one of the few species you're allowed to hunt in this culture. So that's another reason. It wasn't just that issue of him specifically. One of the things, I don't know if the left realizes it or not, I don't think they realize it on a conscious level, but the reason that they reacted so harshly to this is because the idea of a person making a moral stand of any kind makes them exceedingly uncomfortable. They think they're being moral, but they're not. They're basically just parroting this approved sets of beliefs. But when somebody just stands up and says, "No, I'm sorry, I think this is evil," I wish them the best, but I'm not going to be a part of it. When they say I'm not going to be a part of it, they lose their mind. And I had this experience in high school. I got invited finally in my senior year, and I started making movies and stopped wearing my calculator on the belt and stuff. Started getting invited to parties, and I remember one night very clearly, I was probably 17 years old or something. I went to this party. I was just pretty excited to be drinking beer at this point, to be honest with you. But somebody lit up a joint, and they went around the room, and everybody was taking a hit, and they said, "Here you go, Bill." And I said, "No, thanks." And you would think that would be enough, right? Pretty simple, really. Not no thanks, how dare you, and not no thanks, I'm calling the cops, and no thanks, and I thought this was no, just nothing, just no thanks. But that was not going to stand. So they kept pushing and pushing and pushing. And needless to say, I did not cave into these people, but I did remember thinking afterwards, why was it so important to them that I take a hit of this joint? Why was that so important? And I came to believe that it was important because the fact that I wasn't doing it for whatever reason, chief among which it was illegal, puts them in a spot, and it shows them their moral failings. That was not my intention in going to the party, was to show other people their moral failings, but nevertheless, that's what it did. And so that resistance had to be eliminated. They had to grind me down to the point where I would agree to do this, at which point there would not only would I not be standing above them in their eyes, but their entire moral structure could then resume, right? We want to do this because we like it and it feels good. And if it's against the law, well, then who's to say? This doesn't mean I'm in favor of criminalizing marijuana either. It's just a question of this social proof. Will people make a moral stand? It makes some people guilty. It makes other people inspired. And it makes some people exceedingly uncomfortable. I think that's pretty much what happened. Okay. Oh, look, known miscreant Matthew Lloyd is here. If he said, if you could change the way conservatives think about one thing, what would it be and why? Pop culture, because that's where the battle is. We are always, as a species, fighting the last war. We think our freedom of speech is going to be under assault from guys coming at us with guns, so we have guns. Nope, they're not using guns. They're using things like having your name in the LA Times under white supremacist and all the rest of it. That's what they're using. Conservatives have walked away from the pop culture, which is understandable, but which is not wise. But it's everything. All of the things that this progressive belief, these limousine socialists, these Bernie supporters, I had this thought today at lunch. What they believe in is so shallow. It's so unbelievably shallow. It's why I say that blue map of millennials voting and we win Utah and the Democrats get everything else. I said this ocean of blue is exceedingly wide, but it's very, very, very thin. I never cease to be amazed at how easy it is to flip people on these things. And I was talking with somebody who was a big 9/11 conspiracy person one day, and she was saying, well, this and this and this, and the melting point is steel. And I mentioned, well, look, just because steel's not running doesn't mean it doesn't get soft. It doesn't have to actually melt and dribble down the side of the building before it will no longer hold the load. Things like this. Well, have you ever had a stick of butter? Have you ever dealt with butter? Yes. Have you ever taken butter out of the refrigerator before? Yes. Have you noticed that as the butter warms up, it gets easier to cut with a knife? Yes. Have you ever seen completely melted butter? Yes. Well, then you understand that there is a period in there where as the butter gets warmer, it gets softer before it actually melts, right? You understand that, right? You've dealt with this before. Yes. I guess it didn't happen. That's right. One person I talked out of the 9/11 conspiracy by simply saying this. You could tell that this whole business about a controlled demolition is nonsense for a number of reasons. But if you look at actual controlled demolitions, these so-called implosions, you'll find that they go from the bottom. The bottom goes first. The bottom collapses and then the top comes crashing down. And the towers didn't go down that way. The tops went down first. But I basically said to this person, I said, look, why do you think it is that the building that got hit first lasted longer? In other words, it got hit first, but it stayed up last. First tower got hit first, then the second tower got hit. Then the second tower went down, then the first tower went down. Why do you think of that? What do you think that is? Because the first plane hit higher up. The second plane hit lower. On the second tower, the impact was lower, and that meant that there was more weight above the damage point than there was on the tower right next to it. And because there was more weight above it, the stresses on those loads were higher, and so it collapsed first. It got hit second, but it went down first because simple geometry. If these guys had been well, I'm not going to get into motive or skill set or anything like that. Just suffice it to say that if by accident they had hit very low, if they crashed in on the top, on the bottom 10 or 20 stories, I don't think the towers would have survived the impact. I think they'd be down instantly or they'd be down within a few minutes. My point in this is just simply to say that, well, I guess you're right. Well, it's not so hard to figure out. The melting steel thing is just another example of this. So anyway, they believe it because people get all of their information from the pop culture, and we are so thin in that space, and I'm doing my very best to do something about it. But we still continually run into this kind of just kind of an arched eyebrow, like, pop culture, really? Aren't you going to, I thought you were talking about doing something serious. Like what? Like a position paper that we can write at the Heritage Foundation and then submit to various lawmakers, that kind of thing? Or do we want to actually go and change people's minds and give them some social proof, some permission to believe the things that we believe? That's why I've said a couple times that Kanye West supporting Donald Trump is the most important thing that's happened in this country since the election of Donald Trump. He put a big crack in this continuous wall of shame. The wall of shame that's designed to make anybody with a conscience feel guilty about being a conservative, feel guilty about being a Trump supporter. You're a racist, and you're a bigot, and he's an idiot, and along comes this guy who I have very little respect for earlier, much more lately, simply because he hasn't given in. And he says, I kind of like him. And then he gets death threats and calls from all of his colleagues, and fairly reliably calls from the former president of the United States saying, you can't just say that you agree with somebody who's on the other side of the fence here, because if you do, that's the end of the game. And sure enough, support for Donald Trump among black American males went up, doubled in a week. So that can't be allowed. So I would say pop culture, known miscreant. Martin Archer is next on my list here, and he says, most liked question from last week. Well, congratulations. I'm sorry I didn't get any questions last week. Did you see the Monk debate with Jordan Peterson, and why the hell aren't you debating leftists all the time like he is? You do just as good as in jobs of arguing points, plus you have more charm and much more of a sense of humor than he possesses. Thank you, Martin. I just don't know if I have the thickness of skin, to be honest with you. I do have to say that one time when I was just completely blindsided by Malibu Trotsky, I was quite shocked at the inner calm that came over me. That was really quite a surprise. Really, really very calm about that. I'd like to do it on a panel. I'll be perfectly honest with you. I would be doing a lot more of it, except that the audience bias is almost insurmountable. In other words, if I were to go on the Bill Maher show, I feel like I could not only handle Bill Maher, I feel like I could handle Bill Maher plus the other four, however many people there are there. But if everything you say gets jeered and laughed at by the audience, and everything they say gets thunderous applause, you can't. It's a very difficult social proof headwind to fight. Because it reinforces the beliefs that these people had. So if it were to be an actual debate, under controlled circumstances, which, like a presidential debate or something, they could give my liberal opponent the answers to all the questions. I don't care. We're gonna wipe the floor with them. I should be doing more of it. The whole Jordan Peterson phenomenon is amazing. I think that Jordan Peterson is largely successful because he's not using quite so political terms. He's not really talking about Republicans, Democrats, liberals, conservatives. He's talking about people as a psychologist that disarms a lot of people, gets them out of their trenches. But he's also just a very even-tempered fellow, and he just seems imperturbable. I mean, nothing seems to get to him. There are people like that who are able to maintain that, just walk into this monkey cage of screaming social justice warriors and just simply, endure it and then respond. And so there are some people with thick skin, and then there are people like Andrew Breitbart, and I perceive Ben Shapiro to be this way, and certainly Milo is, although he's pretty much vanished, who actually seem to like the fight. They seem to enjoy it, and I do not enjoy it at all. I'm pretty good at it, but it's not fun for me. A controlled debate, with a moderator who is relatively impartial, and a certain amount of time and structure, and rebuttal time and so on. I think that I would definitely be a part of. But in any event, I'm not very willing to walk into the Bill Maher show and just. It's not discouraging. It's not embarrassing. It's not even really. I was going to say it's not even so much unpleasant as it's just frustrating. It's like you watch these people reinforcing all of their beliefs for the stupidest reasons, Somebody gets, they make some kind of simple, easy to do comment, like, at least, the people in Africa are building our cell phones for 2 cents an hour. I'd like to live in a world where we have at least the decency to make sure that doesn't happen. And now, now I have to say, okay, let's just slow down. 2 cents an hour is what they're working for, whatever the number actually is. So why are they working for 2 cents an hour? It's because people are pushing other people out of the way to work in these horrible conditions for this terrible wage. Because it's the best work there. You see? It's the best work there. And I was watching just briefly, just as another one of these wandering asides that we always get off on, this whole purpose of the show. I was watching this documentary on what they called the most toxic dump in the world or something. And basically what it was, I want to say it's in Ghana, in Africa. And it's where all the world's electronics get dumped. And there are people who simply go through these garbage piles and are pulling out the copper and whatever parts that they're looking for. And when they come to plastic, they just set it on fire. So there are these burning little, clusters of burning plastics and heavy metals and all the rest. They say it's a tremendously toxic environment and exceedingly unpleasant. And here's the thing. It is exceedingly unpleasant. And I don't like seeing people doing this kind of work. But the thing that struck me the most watching this was, this is miserable, but I would rather be doing this than doing what my personal ancestors were doing 4 or 5 generations ago, which is either working in a textile mill or in a homemade coal mine. What did I see recently about mining? Somebody just crawling in this mine. My family is coal miners back to as far as we could tell. Coal miners and then textile workers, cotton carders. I've mentioned this many times. For those of you who may be relatively new, wouldn't be my father, my grandfather, my great-great-great-great-grandfather, somewhere around in there. He and his father, and I think his father, were all working in a textile mill, and they were cotton carders. And what a cotton carder does is he prepares the cotton for being spun into thread. The thread is then used, obviously, to make the cloth, and that's a big part of the Northern English economy for hundreds of years. But a cotton carder is somebody who they basically hand a lump of cotton, just a clump of cotton, about the size of a baseball, I guess, raw cotton. And a cotton carder has 2 wooden boards. They're about, this big paddles. Primitive leather strap on both sides so they can hold these paddles like this. And then there are these wire hooks, very thin wire hooks, kind of like the wire brushes you see sometimes for pets and so on. So they've got these 2 panels, one on each hand with wire hooks, and somebody hands them a piece of cotton and they do this. And what they're doing is they're aligning the strands and they're getting the seeds out. And it takes, I don't know how long it takes to do one of these things, it's several minutes anyway. And then they hand that off to the next person who takes it over to be spun into thread, and then somebody else gives them another piece of cotton, and they did that 10 hours a day, 6 days a week for 100 years. Family members who were fathers of 11 children, 9 children, waking up in the morning, and first thing you do is break the ice on the bowl of water in your room, so you can wash your face. And while cotton carding and working in a textile mill was not only mind-numbing and dangerous, it was also freezing in there. They decided they didn't want to heat that place because that cost money. So, and you started working when you were 6. These are my ancestors we're talking about. And coal mining was much worse. Aside from the fact that you're very likely to be killed in a cave-in, because it wasn't bracing. I mean, people had in Wigan. I can't remember which one is it's the one that's not the police chief. Wigan. So it's Wigan. Anyway, I think somebody said there was something like 8,000 coal mines within a 1 or 2 mile radius of the center of this town, because people would simply go out into their backyard and start digging down so they could get some coal so they wouldn't freeze to death in the wintertime. And that's not a pleasant experience, mining coal under any circumstances. And under those circumstances, it meant you would die of black lung disease, or you take a bath and once a week and you get the hot water, and by the time you're done, it's inky black, and then goes your wife, then all the kids, and last goes the baby. And by the time the baby's being washed, the bath water is so black and dark and inky that you run the risk of throwing the baby out with the bath water. So here's my point, though. I saw these people in 2017 doing nasty work. And I don't like that they're doing nasty work, and I don't say, hey, too bad for them that they're doing nasty work. I would like it if they weren't doing nasty work. But what strikes me is they're doing work that is less nasty than my ancestors did. And the problem seems to be that my ancestors had some kind of vision of a better world that this sacrifice would improve. And when I say this sacrifice, I'm talking about the sacrifice of their lives. There's something about certain people or cultures, I don't know what it is, but there are certainly, many of you as well, I know, there's a particular kind of a human thought process that says I'm born into this miserable world and I'm going to work hard in this miserable world. It's miserable work and I'm going to have to work hard just to feed myself. But I'm going to do that and enough to feed another person. And then the two of us are going to have 11 children. I'm going to have to work hard enough to feed them. And furthermore, I'm going to have to work hard enough to feed them and save enough money so that there's a chance they might go to school someday. What I'm saying is, what seems to be different is that when my family was coal miners, they were working towards a day when they wouldn't have to be coal miners. They were working towards a day when they would have the unspeakable luxury, unimaginable pleasure of working in a textile mill. So they did that for 4 generations. And then I think they were plumbers for 2 generations. Then my grandfather made an enormous leap. He was a telephone lineman. He was hanging telephone lines around 1912 when we came over here, 15? I've forgotten. But that was a bleeding edge technology job, hanging telephone lines in the early 1900s. And then after that, it was hotel manager and then internet celebrity. So the de-evolution continues apace. Let's see. Eric Blake says, greetings, Bill Whittle, Vectron of the Aurora Star Republic. Here's a movie question I know for a fact you will love. 2 years ago, I learned of some movie news that really reminded me of your classic George Washington Virgin Airlines pitch. As you would always sum up, because George Washington was a swinging deadly dude and that's why we love him. Yes, I practically know the darn thing by heart. As such, I've been long meaning to bring this up for the lounge, but like a dunce, I keep forgetting. So here goes. 2 years ago, Zack Snyder, director of 300, and in my admittedly not so humble opinion, the greatest on-screen treatment of Superman ever, Man of Steel, noted that he would love to do an American Revolution flick in the spirit of 300. As he put it, the classic painting of the Delaware Crossing is so awesomely stylish in a way that invokes 300. And with that, one thought filled my mind, and I quote, because George Washington was a swinging deadly dude and that's why we love him, seems like Zack Snyder loves him too. Thoughts? P.S. I'd love for you to recite that pitch tonight. Personally, I'd have the 4 gorgeous women in question be your friend Kelly Carlson, Gal Gadot, a.k.a. Wonder Woman, Margot Robbie, and the angelic Amy Adams. I don't really quite get that last part, but in any event, yes, I would be saying to young people that at Tea Party events and things like this is a subject I still bring up. I say, I understand why we have parchments and quills and we have pictures of the Constitution and we have pictures of Jefferson and Washington and Benjamin Franklin. I understand all of this, muskets and Gadsden flags, and I love it because I understand what these people did. But if you've never been taught these things, and most people, young people, not only haven't been taught them, they've been excluded from learning about them. You are asking young people to get behind a political philosophy of 250 years in the past. And we cannot do that. We have to make conservative something in the future, which is why I'm doing the work I'm doing after hours. But put that aside for a second. Basically what I said was if George Washington were standing here, if you could picture George Washington with me on stage right now, I know what you'd think. You'd think he'd be there in his, in his knee breeches and his, ruffled shirt and his vest and his, his frock coat and his, I never saw a tri-corner hat and a musket and all the rest of it, but that's not what George Washington was like. He was the best dressed man of his time. He was probably the best dressed man in the world. He sent a note to London during the war, I think, and requested 4 very, very nice vests because he wanted to look like the president of a civilized society. So he was the best dressed man in the world. So if he were here today, George Washington wouldn't be wearing all these things. He'd be wearing a $2,000 Armani suit. He'd have an $800 haircut. He'd be wearing $1,000 shoes, and he'd be carrying an AR-15 with a red dot scope on it because he was a swinging deadly dude. That's what he was to the people who knew him. One of the things that I've always felt, and I can't remember the name, there were these cartoonists that were very popular during the Iraq War. I want to say right around 2003, 4, 5, 6, and I've forgotten their name. I have both of their books. They're great guys. But they did something that I've always thought was important, and that was every time they drew Uncle Sam, they didn't draw him as an old man. They drew him as a very, very strong young guy, like just this really strong, healthy young guy. And I like that. I've heard other people say they would like to do that. Washington was absolutely amazing guy. And if you were to do Washington accurately, I think you would miss the Washington. Now, I'm not one of these people that believes in, fake but accurate. I mean, truth is truth and fiction is fiction. But just as one small point of fact, when Washington was sworn in the first time, or certainly the second time, he probably had one natural tooth left. He might have had 2 or 3, but I think he only had 1. His teeth were completely gone. Cox and Forkham, that's it. Thank you very much, George. And blast hard cheese. So he had 1 tooth, and his teeth were not made out of, what did the people said it was made out of wood? It wasn't made out of wood. He had false teeth made out of human teeth, animal teeth, and ivory and stuff, but they were exceedingly uncomfortable. If you just want to Google George Washington dentures and you think about the fact that this man had to have these things in his mouth, his teeth bothered him from the time he was very young, as mine had, until I went and got them fixed. And my haven't had any problems with them ever since they started making them out of steel and porcelain. Mark Twain said that too. Mark Twain said that your teeth are useless. The only time you ever have good teeth is when you can find somebody to construct them for you. I know there are people out there with excellent teeth, but George Washington was not one of them. So if you were going to do this story accurately, you'd have to have a guy who's just the presence of a mouth that was filled with either brown and missing teeth or ridiculous-looking, by modern standards, dentures. Just that alone would so prejudice you against him that it would be it'd be a disservice to him. We look at his teeth, for example, and we'd just be horrified if he showed his actual teeth. Same thing with Elizabeth, by the way. Elizabeth I had essentially no teeth left, and was pretty much completely bald, and her breath just reeked and everything. And we think, my God, how can a queen look like that? Well, a queen can look like that because that's the limit of dentistry. The same for George Washington. He had the best teeth he could afford. But if you're going to do them 100% accurately, this is the kind of thing I'm talking about. You would be up against that kind of bias and prejudice. The prejudice that we have whenever we judge people from the past for not living up to our lofty standards. So if you're going to capture the essence of Washington, you have to go for creating a Washington as Washington appeared to his peers. And a great example of what I'm talking about is one of my favorite entertainment stories ever. Because the second I heard this explanation, I just thought, that's just absolutely brilliant. I completely get it. My favorite piece of entertainment ever is Deadwood. 3 episodes of that show. It's my favorite thing I've ever seen. I loved it. With the possible exception of Les Mis on Broadway. But I loved that show. I loved it. And Deadwood was on HBO, I want to say around 2003, 4, somewhere in there. And it had a reputation, well-deserved I might add, for being the most profane show on television. That the language in that show was just unbelievably, unremittingly profane in every regard. And they asked the show creator, whose name escapes me now, Michael something, it'll show up in 28 seconds or something. They said, surely the people of Deadwood didn't use these words like, some of the compound adjectives that we have and all of these F words and all of these other words and C words and all the rest of it. They certainly didn't use those words, right? And he said, no, they did not use those words. They used words like damn and bastard and go to hell. But damn and bastard and go to hell was the strongest language they had. And if we were to use that actual language now, we'd be historically accurate, but we'd be emotionally false. The reason we're using these words is because people used in that mining town, they used words as a defense against attack. They basically spoke in such a way that was so shockingly profane that people didn't want to mess with them. And that's why we use the F word and all these other words. And I thought that is absolutely brilliant. That's exactly brilliant. That's it. He's recreating the emotional truth at the expense of the historical accuracy. He's trying to shock modern audiences with language that's unbelievably aggressive, because the language that those people used was incredibly aggressive. But if it turned out that you said, "Oh hell," and that was supposed to empty the room, it just wouldn't work. And that's what I would have to do, I think, if you're going to do Washington. You'd have to try and create modern, what's the word? I'm not analogies exactly. Modern extensions, I guess, of the things that happened to him. So he'd have to be handsomer than he was, because he was, by the standards of the time, an incredibly handsome guy. I don't remember what Washington's actual height is. Somebody will tell me again in a second. It might have been 6'4", something like that. If you're going to do it in a movie, you need to make him, today, you need to make him 6'8", right? Because 6'4" in 1776 was unbelievably tall. Just shockingly tall. You need to add a couple of inches to that, for at least that. In order to give the impression of just how big this guy was. And he'd have to be really handsome and well-dressed. But the idea of doing it in the style of 300 is a great idea. And it reminds me of somebody who was kind enough to Photoshop my face on it. I'm sure you've seen these pictures of various presidents, historical presidents, as paintings, and one of them is Ronald Reagan. He's riding a velociraptor. He's got an American flag in one hand. He's got an Uzi or something in the other, and he's just gunning down people. And they're all made to look like badasses. And that's kind of that's what he was. So, yeah, I think that's how I would do it. And I hope Snyder has the means to do it. Dave Olson, Normandy. Beautiful question. So today is June 6th. It's the anniversary of D-Day. Yeah. Some people are shocked to know that, I forget the exact number, but I think we had 800 men killed in the rehearsal for D-Day. It's not widely known. It would have been considered catastrophic for morale. But prior to the D-Day invasion, there was a rehearsal and exercise of the D-Day invasion. And it involved bringing guys on shore, as you would think you would probably do. And the naval protection was not up to snuff, and a U-boat got in there and sank a transport or something like that. And 800 men were killed rehearsing for D-Day. It's so interesting being married to a Russian woman, because if you understand, really get down to the brass tacks of history, especially World War II, it's very tough to make an argument that's impressive to Russians because of what they suffered in that war. But and I'm including Stalingrad in this, I cannot think of of an example in the Eastern Front that required the same kind of individual courage that the Rangers going up that cliffside had. I can't think of anything in the war, or any war, that matched that. Edward Smith actually says the Germans didn't guess it was a rehearsal. Yes, they knew it was a rehearsal for the invasion. They knew the invasion was coming, for 2 years. They just didn't know where. And just as a quick aside, I've forgotten the name of the operation, but Hitler was convinced that the landings would occur in Calais, which is the shortest distance. Normandy's significantly further away. It's a significantly longer ride to get to Normandy. And Hitler was convinced that they would land in Calais. As a matter of fact, one of the reasons why he didn't respond quickly enough was, first of all, he was sleeping. Nobody wanted to wake him up for fear of, you don't wake up Hitler. So he didn't know about it until 2 o'clock in the afternoon that day, something like that. But Hitler also didn't react quickly enough because he was sure that the Normandy landing was a feint, that the real attack was going to come in Calais. One of the reasons the Germans were so convinced of that was because of an intelligence operation, which I think was run by the British. What they did was they had the body of a British officer who'd been drowned in some kind of an accident or something, but he just died and he was drowned. And they decided that they would, needless to say, they'd had this plan in effect in advance. They're just waiting for the right candidate. The name of this operation I've forgotten, but it was interesting. What they did was, when this officer drowned, they put orders for the invasion into his pocket. And then they, cover of darkness, sailed him out to the French coast, and they threw him into the water at an appropriate tide. And sure enough, this body washed up on the beach. And the fact that the man was dead and had these orders in his pocket, Steve Darrow said he wasn't an officer, he was a bum. Is that right? That's interesting. I thought that may be true, actually. It's a guy that actually rings a bell. That maybe he wasn't an officer. In any event, there was a British person who died, and they dressed him as an officer, and they put these orders in his on his person and let him wash ashore on the French coast. And the Germans were so convinced that there's no way that this could be an accident. That it went a long way to convincing them that it was going to happen in Calais. And furthermore, there was a great deal of work done by a number of different people to convince the Germans that the landing was going to happen in just across the channel in Calais. They had radio chatter for units that didn't exist. Patton was said to command that particular unit that didn't exist. They figured Patton was the best general we had. He probably was. It certainly was the best tank general we had. And they spent a great deal of time, including decoys and things for the German reconnaissance airplanes to see. They had Sherman tanks that were made out of canvas and plywood. And an enormous amount of effort went into convincing the Germans that we were not going to land in Normandy, but rather in Calais. In any event, so D-Day. There's so much about this particular story that's so heartbreaking. I think the thing that to me is the most heartbreaking about D-Day is, and I just mean this out of respect for the people who were there, my understanding, is it Operation Mincemeat? My understanding is that there was extensive film footage of the invasion. Extensive. And that after the film was shot, somebody somewhere opened either one canister or many canisters and ruined the footage of D-Day. That all we have now, all I've ever seen of the actual D-Day invasion is the same clip, 2 or 3 clips. There's one clip of these 4 or 5 guys running, and one of them drops. There's another clip with a couple little splashes in the water, but there was also a lot of footage of what actually happened on that beach, and it was lost, and I think that's a tragedy. Yeah, Dave Wellman says the movie called The Man Who Never Was. That's right. I think that movie was based on him, based on the. That's quite an old movie now, but yeah, based on the on that particular operation. So I guess that is true. They just invented this whole thing in false orders, false ID, false everything. So in any event, but D-Day is it's tough. You know, on some level, having not been there, it seems that the Marines went through a version of D-Day at least 7 or 8 times. I want to say something like that. When they went ashore on places like Iwo Jima, they did not. They specifically held their fire until the guys got on the shore, so they didn't have the experience of having that gate go down and having the people in front of you just disintegrate. Obviously, the definitive D-Day experience is Saving Private Ryan. And the opening 10 or 15 minutes of that movie are, without questions, one of the greatest 5 pieces of cinema ever made. And I remember watching it the first time. And of all the things I remember in that movie, the thing I remember most was right at the very beginning, where they're just getting ready to go, and they're, and then the water is choppy, and some guys are getting sick, and Tom Hanks' hands is shaking, and they get to the beach, and the ramp goes down, and immediately the first 5 or 6 guys just turned into bone fragments, and just mist and bone fragments. They're just completely shredded and destroyed. And I had thought, needless to say, that I'd see these guys run off the boat, start wading through the water, and then get gunned down. But the idea that they would just be basically just almost, vaporized by this incoming machine gun fire the second the door went down really shocked me in a way that it was supposed to shock me, because it shocked them too. There's a great deal of controversy, not about whether or not, needless to say, about whether or not D-Day helped end the war. There's no question, needless to say, there's no question that it sped up the war, and there's no question that that the advances made by the British and the Americans were hard won and heroic and very, very costly and important. The reason I bring up this as a moment of hesitation is I suspect that if D-Day had never happened, I think the Red Army would eventually have beaten the Germans, but they would have lost a lot more people. Stalin was complaining the whole war, why aren't the Allies doing more? Well, one thing the Allies weren't doing, Stalin was making a deal with Hitler like you were, so maybe you ought to be a little more circumspect in your criticism, because while you were basically palling it up with Hitler, Winston Churchill's fighting Hitler all alone. Now that Hitler's invaded the Soviet Union and the peace treaty you had with Nazi Germany, now that that's being violated, now all of a sudden we're the slackers. The Red Army moved from its deepest positions, came all the way back and took enormous losses and fell back. And my wife has a grandfather who was killed in probably the first or second day of the war, right on the border during that initial German assault. Which is shocking, because you hear about this one, heavy losses. Oh, yeah, heavy losses. Yeah. My grandfather-in-law. But there's so much connected here. One of the reasons that the Soviets were able to travel from the Volga to Berlin was because even prior to Hitler invading the Soviet Union, we gave the Russians 100,000 trucks. 100,000 trucks, Studebaker trucks, were provided by the Americans to the Red Army, and virtually all the boots they wore. Significant number of their airplanes, at least early in the war, and the T-34, which was the best tank of the war, I think, was based on at least on a suspension that was designed by Americans, and we didn't use it. We went with something else for the Sherman tank, and the whole thing about the Sherman tank, and you know, back and forth and back and forth. But here's the thing I think about D-Day. If the Marines had been thrown off the beach, and just the fact that I say if because it's actually kind of amazing that that they never were. I mean, really, if you get right down to it, given the odds they faced, the Marines were never stopped. They just kept coming ashore. But if the Marines hadn't taken Guadalcanal, or if they hadn't taken, Tinian or Tarawa or Iwo or any of these places, the war in the Pacific would have continued. But if the D-Day invasion had failed, it's hard to see how the war in Europe on the part of the Allies would continue for at least another couple of years. That one had to go. And as big as the D-Day invasion was, the Operation Olympic, Operation Downfall, the invasion of the Japanese islands was 4 times the size of D-Day, planned to be 4 times the size of D-Day, and D-Day was by far the biggest armada ever assembled. It was just astonishing. Winston Churchill was responsible for a number of key parts of that invasion working, and the 2 of them that I think come to mind are the Project Pluto and the Mayberries. Mulberries. They knew that if they were going to go to Normandy as opposed to Calais, which they would have just mined and blown up, they never would have gotten the port. It would have been nice to get Antwerp, but Antwerp was also basically, they just, sank block ships in the harbors. They couldn't get to Antwerp right away. So they realized if they're going to land on these beaches, we can get a bridgehead in there, but if we're going to get enough supplies off of these things, we need to be able to bring freighters up to these docks. We can't swim everything. We can't swim our supplies ashore. We gotta walk them ashore. We gotta drive them ashore. It was Churchill's idea to have a floating harbor, build a harbor in Britain, and then tow it out there, and then sink the pilings, and create a pier. So the whole Mulberries were pretty much his idea. One of them was destroyed very early, within a couple days in a storm, but the other one basically unloaded millions of tons of supplies. And I think it was also Churchill who had the idea about Operation Pluto, which was the idea of, rather than, because it all comes down to fuel, they say again and again and again, it's always, always, always the same thing. Amateurs talk strategy, professionals talk logistics. And Churchill had the idea that this invasion is going to run on gasoline or diesel fuel. It's going to be mechanized, and if we don't have enough fuel, we're going to be stuck on the beachhead and we'll get cut up there. So Churchill had the idea that rather than taking fuel over in ships, they would just basically make a gigantic hose and pipe it over. And that's exactly what they did. Just laid a hose on the bottom of the channel and piped the fuel aboard. Interesting that the one thing that we hadn't considered, the biggest resistance to the Americans after landing on D-Day was not the panzer divisions that we were worried about, and it wasn't the Wehrmacht, and it wasn't counterattacks by the Luftwaffe. The big unknown in the invasion was the hedgerows. We didn't have any idea that those hedgerows would be as impenetrable as they were. And while the actual invasion went well, by the time we were at D+30, we were 25 or 26 days behind schedule. I mean, we were supposed to be out of Normandy and out of the hedgerow country within a week, and we were there for months. These thick hedges that they'd used in France as walls, essentially as property walls, were virtually impenetrable. Perfect defensive positions. You basically put everybody it's almost like an urban setting. And finally, American ingenuity came forward with these Sherman tanks, where they put these things on the front that look like the things you put on hair clippers, and they do the same thing. And basically, just once this like kind of forked thing got into the hedgerow, they could plow them up with the tanks. But until then, it was completely stalled, and we were worried about that. Dave Woman says his two boys are World War II tank nuts. I cut by my by my armor opinions. Honestly, yeah, World War II tank nuts. I was one of those as a kid growing up. I built models of everything, everything. I remember those so well. I want to say they were 1/72nd scale, but I'm not sure. But I remember building. I certainly remember building the Shermans, and then you built the various Panzerkampfwagons, the threes and the fours that were kind of old-fashioned, and then you had the four wasn't a bad tank. Then the Tiger was basically the same kind of thing as the PKWs, and same kind of squared-off frontal armor, huge gun on the Tiger one. And then I especially remember building the Panther and the Tiger too, the King Tiger. Those two tanks were just awesome. They just looked cool. They looked like they were from the future. The Panther and the King Tiger were just sloped armor. They looked like they were from the next war. A lot of what Germany made would look like it was from the next war. The problem with the Panthers and the King Tigers are unbeatably good tanks. They're great tanks, but you didn't make enough of them, and they didn't make enough of them. They had too many mechanical problems, and they came too late. So, but my friend Steve and I used to play with these tanks, and this is before laser tag, and now you can get models that do this. I see it, oh man. But we would just crawl around in the dirt out in back of this house, and you'd be on one side, be on the other, and we'd just kind of pushing our tanks along there. And whenever we see each other, we had lots and lots of tissue paper and straws, and we'd just shoot spitballs, and the first guy to hit the other guy tank was the winner of that. And this craziness. That was a lot of fun. There was another story about this, something about the model making. It's just eluded me. But in any event, so Dave, I know this has been very, meandering, but there's nothing I can say about D-Day that is not better said in Saving Private Ryan. And as I said, I can't think of a example of greater bravery under fire than going ashore on that beach, and especially the Rangers, who had to go ashore under that fire and then scale this gigantic cliff with they're essentially with their bare hands, and shoot some ropes up there. And unbelievable. And I suppose it bears a mention to think just for a moment anyway of some of the Wehrmacht soldiers that were just, they were just guys who were drafted and they're fighting for their country. And it must have been a hell of a thing to wake up one day and look out the slits of that bunker and not be able to see any water because there were so many ships there. It would scare the living daylight out of you. And even though they got a lot of our guys going ashore, none of those initial positions survive. In fact, the other thing too, by the way, just bears mentioning, I think briefly about D-Day, is we all have this image of D-Day and how horrible it was, and it was horrible. But really, it was mostly just horrible on Omaha Beach. We forget that there were 5 landing beaches, and that almost all of the casualties were taken on just one of them. So Omaha and Utah Beach were the American beaches, and Gold, Sword, and Juneau, if I remember correctly, were the 3 beaches that the British went ashore on. And most of those were, I don't want to say it was completely like a cakewalk, but it was nothing like Omaha Beach. And that's something that's not often said. All right, let's see. We're going to do 2 more. Known Mystery Matthew Lloyd is back with this question. If deploying lethal force against slow or annoying highway drivers were legal and you could only equip your car with one weapon, what would it be? Missile launchers, flamethrowers, machine guns, proximity mines, gravity bombs, etc. Well, living in LA, Matt, the main quality I'd be looking for is that it must have essentially infinite supplies of ammunition. So it'd have to be an energy weapon, and it'd have to be an energy weapon that was powered by the vehicle, because you run out of ammunition pretty quick in this town. And don't forget the Canadians. Juneau Beach was the Canadians. Thanks, Simon. Didn't mean to slight them. Yeah. Some kind of plasma gun would be cool. There was a game coming out, a game that came out when I was really into Traveller and playing several years where I was into this science fiction role playing game called Traveller, which was basically Dungeons and Dragons in space. And there was a game that came out called wasn't Car Wars. What was it called? Was it Car Wars? I want to say it was Steve Jackson Games. I'm going to check this because the fact that I can remember that it was Steve Jackson Games is astonishing to me. Car Wars. Yep, it was Car Wars. Yeah, there's a picture of it. So this was a really cool kind of a role-playing game where you basically got a chance to armor up your car and weapon up your car and use your car as a vehicle against other cars and so on. I don't want to kill anybody and I don't want to blow anybody up. I just want them to understand the simple, there's one law of the universe, right? There's even more important, it's more fundamental to the structure of space-time and everything we believe. It's more important than the laws of thermodynamics. It's more important than E equals MC squared. And it is the simple, simple, simple law that governs everything in this universe. And that law is slow traffic, keep right. I don't know why this is so hard. Slower traffic, keep right. If you're being passed on the right, you're making a mistake. I thought rather than blowing up cars, it would be great if there were like, demerits. Every time, you got passed on the right, you had to pay a fine. When I say I think that would be great, I think what I really mean to say is that I think it would be horrible. But many, 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 many times, I have sat in the passing lane and watched two cars in front of me that are going exactly the same speed in the same lanes for miles. And I just lose my mind over that. If we had the money, we'd invite 20 million Germans over here, teach us all how to drive, and then send them back home again, by the way, because having talked about D-Day today, I don't know if the idea of inviting 20 million Germans over to your place is such a good idea. Robert E. Lee was criticized by somebody. I want to say it might have been Sherman. It sounds like it might be something Sherman would say. He said he was a great man, but he fought for one of the worst causes that humanity's ever produced. And I think you have to say that to some degree about the German forces in World War II. I read Victor Davis Hanson's latest book called The Second World Wars. He's basically saying that it wasn't one war. You look at the air war over Europe is completely different than. And by the way, speaking of helping the Russians, the American losses in bombers over World War II in Germany was simply unimaginable. It's horrific. Your chance of coming back after 25 missions was something like 3% or something in 1943. And that actually had a pretty significant impact on the war. Anyway, I've completely forgotten what I was just talking about. I was just looking at the comment section. It just flew away. What was it? Let me go back and see if the question rings a bell. If not, that was Car Wars and all that other stuff. And driving and all the rest. I don't remember in any event. We're going to do one more and then we're going to call it a night. And that is from Merlin Wendelboe. Try this again. People keep score, I notice. The rage and the hatred just builds and builds until it becomes almost overwhelming, and then the question is answered, and let the chips fall where they may. So here's the last one for the night. Merlin Wendelboe, try this again. Obama's puppet master, Valerie Jarrett, and Hillary's puppet master, Huma Abedin, are both Iranian. The Iran deal was pushed through at all costs. Meanwhile, people worry about Russian influence over Trump. Why is there so little attention being paid to the true threat? It's because it's Democrats. The answer is because Democrats, Merlin. Anytime you have a question like this and you see things that don't make any sense, that are completely inverted, the answer is because Democrats. If there was a independent news media, they would have found that this Iranian deal was treasonous. And the equivalent would be Donald Trump sending vast amounts of money to Vladimir Putin, lifting all restrictions and sanctions against Vladimir Putin, and having two of your closest advisors in the cabinet being Russians. You know, they keep trying to. We keep trying to do it. So, you know, this is here's the thing, Merlin. When you get into this fight and you stay in this fight, the first thing to go is your idealism. It's your sense that I simply cannot believe. I can't believe what I'm seeing. I can't believe the injustice of it. I can't believe the injustice of it. But there you go. It's there, and there's nothing we can do about it right now. Thank God for the internet, and that's why, as I said before, this YouTube and Facebook suppression is the only thing I've actually really feared since I've been in this business. We made an enormous mistake putting our communications in the hands of private companies that are run by our ideological adversaries, and whether or not those, somebody mentioned in the comments earlier, whether or not those should be considered utilities is a good question. I think they probably should be. Having just said my idealism is largely gone, my belief in justice is largely gone because of this press bias. But I remember a couple days ago, there was a pretty big deal being made out of the fact that Mark Zuckerberg swore under oath in front of Congress that, I don't know if he was under oath. I know he was in front of Congress. And he said that, Facebook users completely control their own information. Well, it turns out that's not true. And the only reason we're hearing about this story is because the liberals are lathered up, because one of Trump's political advisors, was it Spectrum? One of Trump's organizations got a hold of Facebook data, and that outraged the left. The fact that Facebook's been spreading this data for a decade and suppressing conservative comment, none of that bothers them. But the fact that these Facebook leaks helped Donald Trump win is a crime that needs to be investigated. But, man, I would like to see that guy go to jail. I don't think that about many people. For example, there are some people who I despise. I despise Michael Moore. I think Michael Moore is a vile, reprehensible, horrible person. But I don't think Michael Moore should go to jail. I don't think Michael Moore deserves to be in jail. Same for Bill Maher and all the rest of these people. They don't belong in jail. They're wrong. But Zuckerberg, there's something about that guy. The arrogance, if you saw The Social Network, he's not a pleasant guy, and he's not a good guy. And I don't know how to explain this, but he also, because if you compare our bank accounts, there's some compelling evidence that I'm wrong about this, but he also doesn't strike me as a very smart guy. He's certainly a very savvy guy, and his business sense and all of those instincts are superb. And he built an enormous company out of absolutely nothing. I'm not trying to take that away from him at all. But intellectually, he doesn't strike me as a particularly bright bulb. He doesn't strike me as a terribly smart guy, and he certainly does not strike me as an educated guy. So I enjoyed I don't know, what was it, couple of hours maybe, where Zuckerberg had to squirm in the same way that we do on a daily basis because of decisions that Zuckerberg makes. But I would, we when the November election is over, we're going to look back on the first 2 years of Trump's presidency, and we are going to say, what the hell was the matter with us? I mean, I could see this coming, but we're gonna look back on it and say we had 2 years where we had all three of the levers that we needed: the House, the Senate, and the presidency, in order to get things done, and we did essentially nothing with it. We did very little with it in terms of domestic policy. If we lose the House, and it looks like we're going to, at least it looks less likely than it used to seem absolutely certain. Maybe less so now, I don't know. But traditionally, the party that wins the presidency loses the House in the next off-year election. So, but if we lose the House of Representatives, what are we going to do? Well, we're just going to do what we always do. We're going to complain. We're going to complain and bitch about it, but we're not going to do anything. This is the pop culture argument again. By this time, the entire upper level staff of FBI, certainly the FBI, likely the NSA and IRS, they'd all be fired, at least fired, and with investigations to follow, and restocked with people from the ranks. I would have cleaned out the FBI my first day. If I knew what Donald Trump knew about the FBI and James Comey, I would have fired him. I would have fired him as I was walking off the podium after the inauguration speech. I would have fired him right then. And if I'd known what he knows, I would have done it, and I would have gone straight to the American people about it. I would have just simply told them, look, this. We talk about draining the swamp. Now we know. So that should have happened. Hillary Clinton should be under indictment and should be in prison by now. Or certainly should be on trial. She should be in prison by now. This isn't Banana Republic witch hunt. We're not trying to dig up stuff that we can stick her with. She is the most corrupt person who's committed enormously destructive, treasonous felonies, more felonies than you can count. And the fact that she's not in jail tells everybody, her supporters and our supporters alike, it tells her supporters that she didn't do anything wrong. And it tells our supporters that that there's no rule of law anymore, which is not a good thing to have in a country that's based on the rule of law. If people give up believing in the rule of law, and I'm at that point now, by the way, then you're on the edge of a precipice. I do notice that the wall is not built. I notice that there's not pictures of a giant construction of a border wall. I don't know. I mean, if it were me and I'd gone to the trouble of getting elected and I knew what just getting elected, just that ordeal is enough to make a person just want to go away from this planet and never come back. But if I had been elected on these promises, I'd get them done. I mean, I'd get them done. And I understand that there is resistance that I'm unaware of, that there. It's easy to say I'd get them done, but that actually getting them done is tough. But now we're back to the Gordian knot kind of thing. Because if I'd been sent as president, they talk about Donald Trump being, crass and vulgar and all the rest. I'm neither crass nor vulgar, but I would be ruthless in a way that he doesn't seem to be. I would go straight to the American people, all of it. The second I knew any of it, I would just go straight to them, and I would say, looked into the CIA. The director is fired. The assistant director is fired. These 4 people have been fired. And they've been fired not because they've been fired because there's compelling evidence to me that that they have allowed politics to influence their jobs. And that's unacceptable, and they're gone. And we're launching investigations into all of these people. And if it turns out that they've committed actual crimes rather than simply moral failures, then we'll prosecute them to the full extent of the law to show people that there is a law in this country. We're gonna make sure that the law enforcement people are the ones who are going to be first subject to this idea of law again. I would have had Hillary Clinton indicted. I'd have her prosecuted and convicted. Whether or not I would pardon her at that point, I don't know. The reason I say that is because it is destructive to this country to put the candidate of half of the country in jail, and needless to say, it's destructive. I would think that the best outcome there would be prosecute her and convict her, show people that she is in fact guilty of everything that we said, and then write her a pardon. And into the pardon you write, we're not pardoning her for any remorse that she's shown or any contrition or anything like that, because she hasn't shown any. We're not pardoning her because we have doubts about her guilt. We think she should be in prison for the rest of her life. We're pardoning her out of respect for the American political system and out of respect for the 40 million people who voted for her. We believe that if that message had gotten out to those people, they would have changed their votes. But in any event, that's what I would do. And by the way, it would be it'd be much worse for her than having her locked up for life or shot or something like that, firing squad. It'd be much worse for her. Only comfort I get is that, Eric Blake said, didn't Trump promise a special prosecutor to look into Hillary's claims? As I recall, he did. And I still keep having this fantasy that I'm going to wake up one day and Jeff Sessions is going to be on TV and he's going to basically say, I've been preparing these for 18 months now, but after 18 months of hard work and the deepest secrecy, I've now got a set of indictments for all these people, but it's not going to happen. It's not going to happen. Commute her sentence rather than pardon her. That's what I meant to say, Matt. That's right. Commute her sentence. Commute her sentence is better, because pardoning somebody basically, relieves them of the ongoing guilt. But commuting their sentence says, no, you did it and you should be in jail, and I'm not forgiving you for it. We're just going to say that you've done your jail time. But I'd book her. I'd perp walk her and I'd get her mugshots. I'd get the mugshots especially. In fact, if I got the mugshots, that's probably all I would need, to be honest with you. Anyway. So, yeah, it's the press. It's the press. It's the press. It's the press. The press. The press. The press. The press. It's the answer to all of our problems. If the press were fair, Obama never would have been elected. Hillary Clinton never would have been elected. That means Donald Trump never would have been elected too. Obama would never have survived his first campaign if there was anything like reasonable application of truthful standards rather than covering up stories that hurt Democrats and prosecuting to the full extent of the law stories that may or may not be true about Republicans. That's the world that we have built for ourselves, is the world we abdicated from back in the 60s. When I think all of our present problems, by the way, I think you can sum up the turning point of all of our present problems, you can put it at one point, and that is early in the 60s revolution, students at Yale University took over the Yale Law Library, or the Yale Library. The Yale Library barricaded themselves in there and issued a list of demands. And Yale granted those demands if they had stormed the building and arrested those people, we may have had an entirely different outcome. I know it seems strange, but sometimes it's true. The big things grow out of little things, and with the value of hindsight, if you'd gotten the little things, you could have prevented catastrophes. You would have arrested guys like Tom Hayden and probably even David Horowitz and a few of these other people, and you would have made it needless to say, expelled them from school, face criminal prosecution, not for their politics, just for the fact that they've destroyed public property and then all the other things that they've done. And then we could have avoided, I think. Obviously, they're big undercurrents, but if we had done the little thing first, we would have been much better off. And it's the same thing with the Nazis. We wouldn't have had to have a D-Day or a D-Day remembrance if the British or the French had the courage to put a platoon of policemen on the bridge leading into the Rhine in 1935. If Hitler sent the German troops into the Rhineland, the Rhineland was demilitarized as part of the Treaty of Versailles. His generals were 100% sure that the French and the British were going to attack. Hitler was sure they wouldn't. And Hitler had given these guys orders that if there's any resistance, turn around. If they'd put a policeman on that bridge, a policeman with a little flat, hat and a little club that big, if he'd stood in the middle of that bridge and refused to turn around and they'd had to kill him in order to get past him, there wouldn't have been a World War II as we understand it. He simply would have he would have turned around. And the generals, this isn't speculation, I'm not making this up. We find out after we won the war, one nice thing about winning a war with your adversaries is you get to look at their documents, those that survive. And the German High Command, OKW, Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, basically said, if Hitler had sent troops into the Rhineland and if there had been a confrontation, we not only would have pulled our troops back immediately, we would have taken Hitler out and had a coup, and we probably would have shot him. Which returns me once again to this idea that this, all these alternate history science fiction stories where people go back in time and change something, and then you realize that the present is some kind of horrible dystopia that should never have taken place. More and more, I feel like, yeah, and we're on the dystopia timeline. Teach people some history and all of these historical problems don't develop. But if you don't teach them history, you will make the same mistake again and again and again. Sounds like there's a pithy statement in there somewhere, if I could only think of what it was. All right, it's 8 o'clock, time for me to go home. Thanks very much for joining us for this Stratosphere Lounge episode, which has a name, and I don't know what it is, but I'm going to guess it is... I'm going to have to back up. I don't care. It's 180, 187, something like that. All right, so hopefully we'll see you next week. I don't think we have anything planned. And until then, thanks for joining us, and we will see you next week. And now begins the process, the part of the show where we begin to shut down the 17 or 18 buttons we have to do in order to end this tale told by an idiot full of sound and fury signifying nothing. So the first thing we have to do is we have to stop record here. Oh, let's first say goodbye to our YouTube fans. Okay, see you later there, YouTube folks. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next week. Goodbye.